Hello, and welcome back to Figure Ed Out, a podcast where we discuss all things related to education, including graduate studies. As always, I'm Jen.
I'm Frankie.
And I'm Sanjay.
So today, what we're kind of talking about is basically research, and like in grad school, when you're thinking about research, it's almost approached differently from research in your undergraduate degree, where you might be doing more, I have to do this assignment, so I'm going to research on this issue, and then kind of being done. So research is a lot more, I suppose, practical, I would almost argue, or maybe even like practice based or theoretical to practice based, linking those two. So kind of the first question I would ask of both of you is kind of like, how do you conceptualize research, or what does research look like to you in your graduate studies?
Um, for me, and I'm just sort of jumping off what you said, Jen, about what research looks like at the undergraduate level and then at the graduate level, and I sort of think about being a research consumer versus a research producer, or a
Ooh, I
knowledge
like that.
consumer versus a knowledge producer. And at the
Mm,
grad level, it's very much you're the knowledge producer, aren't you? And have to follow all those frameworks and all those processes to get um, your research done as part of your course, and then your research published. So it takes it's not an easy process. It takes time.
yeah, that's really well said. Like I find research takes a long time. It's one of those things that has like a long arc. It does pay off in the long run, but it takes time to have itself established. And even this idea of like empirical research, this idea that it needs a track record of proven and confirmation that these things or phenomena are actually existing or affected or whatever we're studying. I kind of come from a different lens just because in my early days I was learning a lot about like the theory of design research, but I kind of worked in quite a few co-production contexts, and so research
Mm.
to me
Mm.
then becomes this kind of like, well, how do we actually open research up and bring in those other voices? So I find that it takes even longer. But you also get a different kind of insight into what knowledge producers and knowledge consumers are, and how those roles can sometimes actually come together or shift, throughout the process.
And then, so for our listeners that may be less familiar, maybe considering a graduate degree, obviously research looks incredibly different depending on what field and faculty you're in. I know for our friends in the science and STEM communities, it might look very specific in the sense that you might just be doing what your
Hmm.
supervisor in the lab wants you to do, and you might be doing some experiments. We're going to be speaking mostly from the perspective of sort of the social sciences. Obviously, specifically, we're in education, but I can speak a little bit to history, and I'm sure Frankie and Sanjay can speak to their diverse experiences a little bit in terms of how it's different in undergraduate versus graduate. But generally speaking, for those of you that may not be familiar, for those of you that are familiar, you can tune out for about a minute and a half. You've got kind of
Yeah.
3.5 different ways of looking at research. You've got qual, quant, and mixed. Yeah, just to kind of start us off, do either of you do qual, quant, or mixed? And like, what does that look like in your mind? Like, can you give an example of what your qual, quant, or mixed research has looked like?
Throughout my research journey, I've stayed within the qualitative because the numbers in quantitative scare me.
Yeah, yeah.
Just I feel like when I read quantitative research, I want more information to understand
Mm,
what's really going on. So because that's my approach to it, I've sat in the qualitative research area for well all of my research journey through my master's and this PhD as well. So I mean, I've in the master's course, it was very much the individual interviews, the unstructured or semi-structured, sorry, interviews. However, with the PhD, it's far more open, and I've been able to establish my own approaches. And in terms of data collection methodology and things like that, I've been able to experiment a little bit as well. So currently, it is still qualitative research, but it's a self-study storytelling approach. but over
Mm-hmm.
the course of the PhD and the coursework in the PhD and discussions and with my supervisor, that evolved. And you know, having to do a bit of work on familiarizing myself with the different methodologies.
Mm-hmm. And how about you, Frankie?
Yeah, for myself, I've actually traditionally gone the mixed methods way. Well, I guess it's not traditional; it's more, it's more new, more contemporary. But yeah, no, I went mixed methods because of exactly what you said, Sanjay. Numbers scare me, and I decided that when I was in my master's or starting my PhD, that I would actually take courses in both areas to at least understand the, the foundation and why we do both types of methods. And I find that in the research that I'm engaged in with languages and identity and stuff, I find that there's actually an advantage to having the quantitative and the qualitative. And to Jen's point earlier about like the mixed versus multiple methods piece, that actual mixing and bringing quantitative with qualitative methods together, and how they can work off of each other. And that's really how I approach it. I would say that I take a pragmatic worldview about everything. I just kind of want the research to work best for the context that's kind of working in. And so, yeah, I've used surveys or questionnaires, and there's actually a distinct difference on that, and we won't go into the minutia of all that. But yeah, so I'd use like questionnaires or surveys, and then kind of mix it with like interviews or focus groups afterwards. And how do the responses explain some of what's going on in the surveys? And we would call that an explanatory sequential mixed methods. It's a process that is explaining, or the other way around. How do survey responses explain what people are saying in their interviews or focus groups? So I've really enjoyed this mixed kind of space. It's not very neat. So if you're really into like organization and neatness and boxes, mixed methods can be a little challenging in that sense because it requires a degree of flexibility. But I've really enjoyed working in that space, and I hope to continue kind of bringing that for the context they're appropriate in. What about
Yeah.
yourself, Jen?
I am kind of, I would argue, halfway in between you two, in the sense that like my master's was very qual, semi-structured interviews like Sanjay. My PhD is going to be more mixed, like what Frankie was talking about. But what you both have been saying, it really made me think about the idea of like, even as we talk about mixed methods as like incorporating quantitative and qualitative, but I think this really points towards the orientation we have as largely qualitative researchers, in the sense that we want to use data to uncover overall sentiments and overall feelings, but then we need the qualitative data to explain those feelings or to explain those experiences. And I absolutely, that's my orientation, in the sense of, I have done surveys, I've done frequency analyses, which is, counting who said what. I've done Likert scales, which is, the degree to which people agree with things or disagree with things. And I find them helpful, and so I'd like to learn more. And I think it's part of in how qualitative researchers tend to design their surveys or their questionnaires in a very sort of, I'm not going to say simplistic, because I think I certainly as an emerging researcher do not know nearly enough about all the complexities of
Yeah.
survey and questionnaire writing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm not going to say simplistic, but
Mm.
I think because we're oriented towards, oh, I'm going to need additional context anyway, whether that's additional questions about like, please explain what you're thinking, or it's an interview or a focus group. But I think you're making a very good point, Frankie, in terms of I don't think I get enough information, and part of that's because I don't know enough, and part of that is because I think the natural orientation I have as a qualitative researcher is that it is impossible to know anything for sure. And so even when I'm given concrete numbers, I consider, were they hungry or tired when they were filling out the survey? And does that mean
Mm.
that they were trying to answer it quickly, so they maybe didn't put enough thought into it, or things like that? Any point of data being
It's
potentially skewed or potentially impacted by the context in which it was taken, the data was collected.
Yeah.
it sounds like you're talking about variables. Is that our word of the day today?
What?
Yeah.
I think also for what it sounds like, Jen, you're hinting there that there's a contextual element to this. So it's not only sort of cultural context or
Mhm.
societal context, but it's also personal context, whether somebody's hungry or not, or
Yes.
think and I mean I do believe that all that matters. And how do you capture that? And how does it impact your data collection or your results or your findings? Yeah, all questions I think about a lot.
Yeah, and I think that also comes into play in terms of your ontological orientation.
Yes.
And we're not going to get into that today, but just thinking about, I think fundamentally when you're talking about research, you really need to think about how you view the world, because that will change how you approach research. I've found in education there is a bit of a split in that you have qualitative researchers and you have quantitative researchers, and you've got a few people in the middle doing some mixed stuff. Do you find that our institution or our faculty, more specifically, tends to lean towards one methodology or another, or supports one, or maybe encourages researchers to pursue one avenue more than another? Or is it down to the individual researcher and supervisor?
That's interesting because
That's
I think you
interesting.
got a history of things going on. Sorry, Sandra, you were going to go?
Oh, go no, no, go on.
I was gonna say you got a bit of a history too. Like, I think for listeners that might not, maybe you're new to this world, or again, if you're listening to this, you're probably thinking about it or kind of thinking about these questions. But I think there's a history of what methodologies are in research and the kind of weight that they carry. In traditional science, quantitative methodologies were typically seen as an objective, truthful kind of, you can remove the person out of this and it's just a fact. But as qualitative researchers kind of started to advocate for over time, they've started to understand, well, there's nuance, like Sanjay was saying earlier, there's context, and context matters. And qualitative research has then become understood to be a valid type of approach. And now mixed methods is kind of that space where they're like, well, you can't just mix both. You either are one or the other. And so I think that context kind of matters.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking about what you were saying there, and also what Jen said previously, and um, it's the approach. We're talking about the approaches you take, and things like that. And I mean, I know for my research journey, it always started with, as Jen said, your fundamental beliefs, your epistemological beliefs, your ontological beliefs, those, and then you devise your research questions and approaches from there. What I found is, but also the area that you want to investigate as part of your research, um, also informs, the sometimes it works backwards and informs your questions and then your view, because I know qualitative researchers who've done quantitative research, although that's not their specialism area, but they've done that. And I know quantitative research who've done qualitative research, although that's not their specialist area. So from my experience, it wasn't linear where you decide on your worldview and then you decide what area you want to explore, then you decide what your questions and then your methodology. And it was not. It was all a bit nebulous, and working with, and finally coming down to establishing what feels right or fits
Mm.
right within where you are. And somebody's research journey you can change. It doesn't mean you start as a qualitative researcher and you're a qualitative researcher right through. You can change. um and the same on the other side. It doesn't mean if you start with it as a quantitative researcher, you stay with that for your whole career. Yeah, those were the things I was just thinking about as we were
Yeah.
speaking.
My question was kind of loaded in the sense that I don't think our institution supports one kind of
Agree.
research or another, but I think you make a very good point, Sanjay, about how your perspective evolves as a researcher and how you approach it. And I would argue that coming in as a master's student, um, I did not have an ontological orientation or an
Yeah.
epistemological
What
orientation.
is
Oh,
that?
yeah.
Exactly. So I think a lot of your what I would kind of say to incorporate what you were both talking about was that I think your orientation or your approach may be initially shaped by your large influences. And that could be your supervisor, that could be your faculty if they've got strong opinions, that could be an older, like a mentor researcher, or a classmate that has really firm ideas about things. And I think,
Yeah.
like you were saying, Sanjay, it is definitely an iterative process in the sense that as you go through your learning or as you go through your research, and sometimes you never want to do a PhD, you just want to be a researcher, and you can do that with an undergraduate degree, especially if you majored in something like sociology, when you probably learned all of these methods in undergrad. But if you didn't, or you weren't very familiar with them, you tend to be shaped by those around you, and then slowly but
Mm,
surely, as you explore alternative methodologies, alternative approaches, you may develop that iterative cycle of, oh, I'd like to try that. Oh, I tried that and I didn't like it, or I tried it and I loved it. And you develop your own sort of orientation over time, but you have to have the confidence to change from the orientation of the people who taught you essentially. And so if you've got more qual researchers, you're probably going to lean qual. If you've got more quant, you're probably going to lean quant in your formative, like when you first learn about research.
mhm.
But also, I think I would argue that your supervisors have a big effect in the sense that, especially in your masters, they tend to push you more in a specific direction simply because they're trying to help and they think that you're suited for this methodology, or that this is an easier methodology, or that that's a more approachable, if especially if it's your first time conducting research. And there are some supervisors that are very open, saying study what you want, do what you want, especially if you know what you're doing. Um, but I think that it can be incredibly impactful, and you can end up on a path that you weren't expecting because of someone you trust and support and who mentors you, and their direction and their version of orientation. And on that note, I did a study. I was in a research assistant position, and I was doing a study, and the people I was working with were all very quant, and
Mm.
we were taking a survey, and we were downloading it, and we were doing the initial analysis, like the broad categorization of the data to then analyze as a group. And I learned very much about the difference in our orientation in that situation, because what I did is I took the Likert scales and I took the responses and I color coded them, because I wanted to see basically like a heat map of how people responded to these questions. So we could look
What?
and discuss and talk about it. And my colleague who was on the project with me, she did, I will not even pretend to know what she did, but essentially she did an analysis and had calculations on how different the responses were from each other. And so she had a bunch of numbers, and they meant something to her and they meant nothing to me. And I had a heat map which meant nothing to her and meant so much to me. And we realized how far apart we were methodologically. And I was really interested in learning more about her method. But like you said, Sanjay, like you said, Frankie, the numbers scared me a little bit. And so but I think that that was a really stark realization of, even the same data set, you can look at wildly differently, and
Yes.
how you interpret that data,
Yeah.
how you analyze it, and it speaks to your orientation. It speaks to like how you view the world, how you view the changes that happen in the world, how you view approaching taking that data, that raw data, and turning it into something meaningful.
Yeah. I mean, I find that when people talk about research, it's always framed as a very personal, individual thing. But you know, I think learning from colleagues has been a big help for me. Only very simply just asking the question, what are you doing with your topic that you're investigating? How are you doing this? And I know we've had discussions outside of this space where I've then walked away going, oh, that's a really interesting idea. I'm just
Mm.
going to go investigate that or think about that or come back and ask about that a little bit more. And there are influences in what I have designed for my research that have come from yourselves in casual conversations and my supervisor, a much larger extent, of course, but there are elements of all those influences in my decision making on my research design, my questions, my methodology, my analysis process,
Mhm.
all of them. So I think research at this level cannot be individual, cannot be on your own, go off and do it in our discipline area, in the social sciences, in education, perhaps. And I don't know because I've not looked at or worked with people in the hard sciences. Perhaps it's different there.
I was about to say, like, just to both your points that, because I'm the lobbyist from big mixed methodology here, but yeah, so mixed methods teams tend to do exactly that. They bring on people from different worldviews and different perspectives to join a team. And so I've always found that a strong mixed team is usually will have people that understand quant quite well and qual quite well, and just that's actually where a lot of meaning can be created, or well, created, but interpreted, and kind of deduced from some of the findings. And so I'm with you. I think that, I have also left our conversations be like, these ideas are kind of, influenced by the people that we work with and that we network. And I think we talked about it in our last podcast or in our last episode, but just this idea of networking and building a community for yourself, kind of, it goes with other colleagues, graduate student colleagues, but also other professors or other faculty in your member, or when you're at a conference too. I have quite a nice network of colleagues that I respect, and I respect their work as well. Just that can provide me some of that feedback that I take with me as well. And so, and if you're feeling some type of way about attributing where these ideas go, a lot of work gives you an opportunity to give acknowledgments in some kind of way. And it can be a footnote, or it can be, if you're doing a thesis or a dissertation, it's at the very beginning. But I think that that's a really nice way to acknowledge also that, the communities in which you belong and how these ideas are formed, to Sanjay's point, from the experiences of life. We live our life and our ideas change through what we do. So
So my final question, to kind of zoom out a little bit and to help sort of frame this, is let's say you have some vague ideas about your worldview, you have some vague ideas about who you would talk to about what, but kind of coming into graduate programs, how do you decide how to research, but also what to research? Like, how do you make that initial decision? Because that's a decision you're gonna have to live with for multiple years.
it's a great
And
question.
like Sanjay said, sometimes it's method first. You're like, oh, I really want to explore this method, and so therefore I'm gonna find something that fits it. Or it's topic. I'm very passionate about this topic, so I want to find a method that's appropriate for this topic. But sometimes you come in and you're like, I just want to learn. I want to study. I want to become a better researcher, or I want to become a better educator. I want to become someone who can affect change in the world. But so you're not particularly passionate about any one topic. Maybe it's multiple topics, or any one method. How do you kind of approach that? How do you make those initial decisions? And what would you recommend people think about if they're thinking about a graduate degree, or if they're already in a graduate degree but have no idea what to study? I'm asking for a friend.
That's a good question. My sort of initial reaction to that would be, um, I think you can approach a master's level degree with a little bit of a looser sort of approach, because it to me it's a little bit more there is more space to experiment and things like that. The way the master's programs are structured in our institution, coming into the PhD, and given time limits as well, because the master's is 2 years, the PhD is 4 years, and you've got a year of coursework in between for each of those degrees, and that certainly has an effect. With the PhD, I think the expectation in admissions is that you've got a far more specific or precise uh, topic or methodology, or even research questions than you would do with a master's.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd add on to that too, is that the PhD, from my experience and from what I understand about it in most of the educational sphere, is that you're also trying to make a novel contribution in some kind of way. And that tends to be an expectation it's not 100% of the time enforced, but it tends to be an expectation of just, if you're producing doctoral level work, then you're producing an idea that's new or contributing to the human knowledge in general. And so, the way I approached finding a topic or selecting, the methodology was very different from a master's to the PhD. In the master's, I had a question from practice. I was a teacher, I had an issue, and I was like, why are we not solving this? And that kind of drove me into master's. And then I realized, oh, there's a whole world here that I didn't even, like, as a teacher, I didn't even realize was existing. And I found a topic that was a little bit more refined there. For the PhD, I did like an informal literature review. Essentially, I just kind of went with this question of like, do we know about this? And for right now, I'm kind of I'm concerned with pre-service teacher education. So I said, do we know X, Y, Z about pre-service teacher education? And I would research and research and research and research and read, and you do your typical scoping review ton of protocol. Um, until I realized there was an area, there's a gap. And I was like, okay, so we actually need to do more research here. And a tip for anybody who's going into grad school or thinking about it is, when you read at the very end of like the interpretations of the conclusions, oftentimes researchers will leave areas of just, there needs to be more inquiry. And they'll let you know of just, based on our research, we think more research could be done here. So you can look at that as a way to just start thinking about your topics and what they want to kind of look for. So those are really good hints to get started with. But that's how I approach it. I did an informal kind of lit review. I found my topic, I proposed it to the people I trusted and my supervisors, and then they would kind of give you some nudges into some other directions you may want to consider. And for myself, deciding on the methodology, I was comfortable with a certain type of way I wanted, or a certain type of method, and I decided to expand a little bit more on my PhD to just explore something, gain some more out of it, try something new, but also what seemed appropriate for the people that I was working with and the problem I was working with.
Totally. You've both given me incredibly insightful responses. And all I can say is I apologize in advance for the response I'm about to give, because my response is a series of questions to ask yourself. And these are questions that I asked myself when I was doing my master's, simply because the reason why I say asking for a friend is because when I started my master's, I had no idea what I wanted to study. I was a little bit like Frankie in the sense that I saw a lot that I had a problem with, or that I thought there might be potential
Room for
solutions for.
improvement.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
room for improvement, but I didn't know necessarily how to approach it. But kind of the questions I wished I had asked myself before I started, not before I started the master's, but before I started the committing to my research, was A, if there was something that I saw that was a problem in my field, or something that I saw that was a problem, and or that I saw that I was very passionate about. And if there isn't, then I would kind of move on to methodology and say, what kind of person are you? Do you like talking to people and asking follow-up questions and
Mm,
listening
Mm,
intently
yes.
to people talk? Then you should probably pursue qualitative, some kind of interview, kitchen table conversation, ethnography, lots of options there. But if that's something you genuinely enjoy, hearing people's stories, then that's one approach. Do you like looking at people, like having the time to process and think about what people are saying by having them respond in writing and then really reflect on it, but also following up 100,000 times on social media and or email and or then maybe surveys and questionnaires are for you.
yeah.
um and so that's kind of, I would argue that going towards those, how do you like to spend your time, is a good way in the master's degree of thinking about it. Um, and also, one thing we haven't talked about yet, if you don't like talking to people and you don't like asking questions of people and you don't like analyzing other people's responses, then you also have sort of a secret fourth option, which is publicly available data. And that's,
Hmm.
there's certainly publicly available data like survey data and interviews, but also publicly available data in the sense of like policy
Social
documents,
media.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yep.
social media, things that you can look at where you don't necessarily need to do the legwork yourself to access the individuals, but at the same time, then you don't get to select the type of person you're looking for, the role of the individual you want to talk to. But at the same time, it means you really are just zoning in on the data. You're really zooming in and focusing on that data. All of these are combinable, and you can use any number of these in your study. But thinking about, I found that in my master's, a lot of my time was spent worrying about the logistics of my methodology. So
Hmm.
who was I going to interview? How was I going to reach out to them? How was I going to get them to sign the consent form? Whereas in my PhD, I'm much more focused on what are these big concepts I want to explore and how do I want to explore them. My master's was much more practical in terms of like getting it done. Which not everyone is going to approach it that way, but that's kind of how I was thinking about it. So I guess the big question is, why are you here? And that's a
Yeah.
much bigger question than we can
That's a
answer
good
in
question.
20
It's a very
minutes.
That's
big
a good
question. Yeah.
question.
But I think that kind of gets, that would have gotten me started on a better foot, um, and really think about how I want to spend my time, because like Frankie said and like Sanjay said, there is so much more to your graduate degree and so much more to the research community than just the research itself. It's the networking, it's the expanding your thinking, and there's so much of that you can get in grad school.
I was going to say, for the listeners who are listening, and you're probably hearing this, we're talking about methodologies. We're talking even just like the methodologies, not the methods themselves. And that's because it's such a large area to
Yes.
cover. It's really hard to capture that in what we're trying to do, which is 20, 25 minutes. And so to give you, just kind of an intro to what it is, but we also want to be clear that we're also going to bring on some guests. We got guests lined up for the upcoming episodes that will help us kind of flesh that out a little bit more. So when we talk about quantitative, well, what are quantitative methods and how do those methods differ from each other? And then qualitative, and what are the qualitative methods? And so, again, it's such a big topic. It's really hard to capture all of the nuance in there, but it's a good place to start and to kind of talk about. And like Jen said, there's some underutilized resources, especially for incoming grad students. Like, you don't need to design and redevelop this wheel. And that's what I think the best advice you'll hear in teaching or in education in general is just, you don't need to redesign everything. And there are swaths of data sets and instruments that have already been validated that could be used and implemented in different creative ways.
Awesome. And on that note, you listen in each session because you never know when our guest speakers are going to arrive. But we look forward to having you listeners join us again. And thank you so much for joining us while we try to figure ed out.
See ya.
Thank you very much. See ya.